Ya Ali Madad, we hope this finds you well. The Economic Planning Board for Kenya is pleased to bring you a series of webinars over the next few weeks that will hopefully provide some valuable insights to help you and your businesses better navigate the current crisis. We will be hosting a number of leading experts on a variety of topics, including employment, taxation, financial planning, and leadership. So welcome to our first webinar. Today's topic is HR and employment. We'll see how employers are adapting to the current unusual circumstances, and we'll attempt to answer some of the recurring questions on this topic. We are joined today by Sonal Sechpal and Elizabeth Waititu. Sonal is a partner with Andrawala & Khanna, a leading law firm in the region, part of African Legal Network. Sonal has been with the firm for over 20 years and currently co-heads both the employment as well as the banking and finance practices. Elizabeth is the head of human resources at Jubilee Insurance, the leading regional insurer. Elizabeth heads human resources across the various lines of business of the company, including general, medical, and life insurance. So Sonal and Elizabeth, welcome. Thank you very much for doing this, for being here and shedding some light on the unusual circumstances we're faced with currently. So to set the context, I think on the one hand, we've had a raft of government directives that directly affect working conditions. So, remote working, social distancing, hygiene conditions, shorter work hours. On the other hand, companies have very different financial imperatives than it did a few months ago. A lot of companies have seen their revenues and their earnings down 50, 60%. Some in tourism have seen their earnings down almost 100%. So very different financial imperatives, different strategies companies have to follow. And obviously we want to do, whether you're an employee or an employer, you want to do what's best. We want to follow best practices. We want to do what's best legally, what's best practically. And so we're looking to shed a bit of light on these circumstances and what are the best practices and best approaches to deal with the current crisis. So to get right into it, in light of the government directives that have come out over the last few weeks, I'll turn to you, Sonal, to get started, and then perhaps Elizabeth, you can take over. What measures should employers take regarding working conditions?
Thanks, Karim. Pleasure to be speaking to you and the community. So in terms of measures, there's been a number of recommendations, both from government and WHO and the global workplace, if you like. Kenya obviously has been experiencing COVID-19 a bit later than other countries, and therefore we do have the benefit of learning from other countries' experience. But in terms of the workplace, employers need to be clear on their legal responsibilities, leaving aside their moral obligations. And legally, under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, they are obliged to maintain health and safety within the workplace. In addition to that, and what's sometimes not appreciated, is that employees also have an obligation to maintain a healthy and safe environment. So it is a responsibility on both parties. But if we just touch on the employer, essentially communicating what this best practice is, whether it's hand hygiene, making sure that there are enough soaps and sanitizers, and obviously running water at the premises, maintaining social distance, and protective equipment in those sectors that require it perhaps more than others. And I'm thinking particularly in areas of the health sector and in other environments where close contact with other employees or visitors to the workplace or customers is likely. I think all of those things would be something that would form part of the employer's legal responsibilities to have in the workplace. And that also coupled with, I know many employers, particularly at factory premises, employing lots of people, English may not be a first language, will have pictorially good practices in terms of maintaining hygiene and safety at the workplace. Those messages would be translated into a language that is understood by a lot of the workers. I mean, all of those things, I think, combined would be good for an employer to adopt.
Thank you, Sonal. Elizabeth, is there anything you'd like to add from a more practical perspective? Say, in the workplace, is there anything that, for example, you've been doing at Jubilee, something that you could advise employers to do?
Yeah, thank you very much, Karim, for having me on this call as well. I'm happy to just be part of this conversation at this very critical moment in our history. And I absolutely agree with what Sonal has shared, and most of what she has shared, the initiatives that we have taken up at Jubilee. What I would add is some of the other practical things we've done is to, in terms of health and safety, is to then also check, have temperature checks for any of the visitors or customers who are coming into our premises, just so that we may be able to pick up something early enough in case someone is not aware, but they may have an elevated temperature. That is also one of the other signs that could point you to a possibility of perhaps having an infection. So we are doing temperature checks. We ensure that anybody coming into our premises is also wearing a mask and has a pair of gloves, just again to minimize the risk of contamination of surfaces or having droplets transferred from one individual to the other. So in terms of workplace hygiene, in addition to all the other things that Sonal mentioned, those are some of the extras we have put in place. The other thing is just to ensure the social distancing guidelines have been observed, and part of observing those social distance guidelines, which is to ensure you have at least 1.5 meters, even up to 2 meters between individuals, has been a core part of our decision as an organization to ensure that as many people as possible are able to work out of the work environment, work from home, so that then we only have very few people coming into the office and therefore can be able to implement even wider social distances for those who must be in the work environment.
Thank you, Elizabeth. You raise a good point on remote working. So again, that can be a little bit confusing to certain employers and even employees. So the government directive has requested employers to show flexibility in the place of work, so to encourage employees to work from home. So there are some staff I think we need to recognize are essential, so may not be in a position to be away from the workplace. So how would you identify these staff and maybe treat them, these essential staff? And secondly, those who are able to work from home, what are best practices, to maintain the right communication channels, to make sure that work doesn't compromise, on this remote working?
Yeah, great question, Karim. And for employers, what across board we would trust that for many employers or even small businesses, they do have a business continuity plan that helps them, manage their business whenever there is a crisis or an interruption of any sort. And this is where the business continuity plans then kick in. So if I give an example of what we are doing at Jubilee, and what I've also noted that many organizations are doing, is that the critical staff are identified as part of the business continuity plan. We must identify who are those people who must be enabled to work. So for example, maybe they handle the core business areas, or whatever your core business is. For example, for us with health insurance, it's a big thing right now that people will be interested in knowing, am I covered? What happens if I go into a hospital right now? We must ensure that then those of our staff who handle critical functions like this are enabled to work either from office or from home. So the process of identifying your critical staff is your starting point, and your critical staff will be dependent on what your core business is. Now, once they are identified, then it's to look at, are there systems that they access that they cannot access, say, from home? Or is there anything that they come to their workplace particularly to do? For example, if people are in manufacturing sector and they must come so that a production line can run, then those considerations have to be taken on board. Now, once it's clear who is essential and is critically important to keep the business going, as it were, then those people must be tooled right. So for those who can work from home, ensure that they have the right tools to work from home. For example, for us, we had to consider that our critical staff access core systems in the organization. And so what we did is that we provided the VPNs, the virtual private networks, to ensure that they can actually carry out the business from home, so remotely. And this we did in the recognition that at this point we may be able to have staff come into the office alternately. However, we were thinking about a potential, what if we get into a total lockdown situation and staff cannot come into their workplace? So we had to ensure that our critical staff are enabled to work either from office or from home. It takes some investment in the tools that are required for them to work well. And that is a call that the business then had to make to ensure that we have continuity of business at any point.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Now, on this issue of remote working, a last question that comes up, and I think that's more of a legal question, is can an employer actually compel an employee to work remotely or work away from their place of work, insofar as these conditions are stipulated in the employment contract?
Yeah, so Karim, most well-drawn up contracts will have a provision allowing the employer to require the employee to work from another location. Often that other location may be other offices of the employer, offices of affiliates of the employer, either in country or regionally. Most contracts, and I've been a lawyer for many years, most contracts will not have a potential workplace at home provision. And if we consider those contracts, because I think that would be the majority of contracts, then we need to consider what is the legal position of employers. Well, firstly, employers have the benefit of the government directive to encourage workers to work from home where they can. And I think that would be reason enough to ensure compliance with government directive, and also to ensure the health and safety of the employee by requiring them to work from home. That said, because it would be a change in the contract, it is prudent for the employer to consult with the employee in relation to the change of workplace, and also ensure that they essentially get the consent of the employee in relation to that, and also provide some necessary tools to enable the employee to work from home. So, for example, in our case, in the law firm, we ensured that our IT policy was revised so that the employees could take their laptops home, could keep them at home, could take equipment from home, such as large monitors, in some cases printers, and that sort of thing. And also we buy bundles for our lawyers so that they always have access to data and are connected at all times. So there are certain things that can be done, but from a legal perspective, consultation and getting consent are key.
So would this also apply to other areas that are stipulated within contracts? For example, leave days. I think this may be a period where a lot of employers would actually, like to have their employees take some of their accrued leave days. If financial conditions deteriorate any further, they may even consider some unpaid leave. They may have to resort to even, salary reductions, for instance. All those variations, amendments, what is the best way of going about it to stay within the confines of the law, but also to do the right thing from a human perspective?
I think we need to distinguish between changes that an employer can make without consent and changes that essentially require the employer to consult and get consent. So most employers will be very familiar with their handbook or staff manual. Most organizations of a size will likely have general terms and policies which are contained outside of the employment contract, but within what is often called a staff handbook or an HR manual. And in the HR manual, there will be provisions relating to hours of work, lunch breaks, overtimes, public holiday, all sorts of things that would not necessarily have to also be contained in the employment contract itself. So the employment contract ordinarily would have the main terms like salary, position, and that sort of thing. And it will also say that the provisions of the staff manual or HR handbook will be deemed incorporated as part of the contract. So the two documents together form the legal relationship. The employment contract will often say the employer reserves the right to make changes to the staff handbook or HR manual, and changes of a kind that affect employees generally, like, for example, the working hours of the business. If an employer wants to change his normal office hours from, say, 8:30 to 5 o'clock or 5:30 to 9 till 5, that's possible without seeking consent. But changes such as take your leave now because taking it later won't do us very good, or our leave liability is increasing while at the same time we are not able to use your services in the way that we need, as if you were in the office, so we need you to take leave now, is a very different conversation. And conversations about taking leave early or at a time like COVID, when the employee is not able to do much more for the employer, that does require consent. Changing the salary structure, for example, during this time will need consultation and consent. And I must stress, Kareem, that I am speaking generally. Each employer, each employee will have their own different sets of contracts that are ever the same. And what I'm talking to is very general advice, and specific advice would need to be sought in any given situation. The other thing I just want to stress is that the Employment Act refers to changes that can be made by the employer after consultation. And the section that deals with this provision doesn't actually make reference to consent. So I've had people asking me, well, why are you advising that I also get consent? And the reason for that is that there is case law, which we do have in Kenya, which essentially speaks to an employer's obligation to get consent as well as consult. So I think it would be prudent to do both.
So in the event you do obtain consent after consultation, is there a need to formalize these changes, even if they're just temporary? Say we're, for 2 or 3 months, we're changing a few aspects of the contract. Does this need to be now formalized?
The act, the section in the act which refers to these changes actually does make reference to documenting these changes. Regardless of that, it's important that whenever there is a change to a contractual position, that is documented by the parties, so that there can never be any doubt on either side as to what has been agreed. So it is important, I think, for both sides to ensure that these things are properly documented.
In the current environment, what are you seeing from some of your clients? Are there any discussions that are happening? Are you hearing of redundancy measures in any manner? What is the approach that employers are following or companies are following? And how is the response from the employees in certain circumstances?
Yeah, that's a tough, because the various businesses are going through different impacts. For example, a business that is in the horticultural sector is very different to one that is manufacturing and continues to manufacture, but is still having a problem because their supply chain is broken and their revenue stream has gone down, but it is not completely gone like a hotelier might experience, or a lodge in the Mara. So, different businesses are experiencing different things. I think what we are seeing is a reluctance on the part of employers to go straight into the arena of essentially termination. I think people are wanting advice on what are their options, and what are the options that mean the least problems for particularly their vulnerable staff. And I think, if I were to summarize generally what businesses that I've been speaking to are doing, then I think it would be in the order of obviously remote working where it's possible, taking of accrued leave, leave that has been carried over from last year on a paid basis, take annual leave that is due, that is accrued this year and is due for the rest of the year in advance. And then there will be the now what, if the pandemic continues, and it, all factors considered, I think employers that I speak to certainly consider that we are in this for a while. The next step would be to then consider furlough, sending employees on unpaid leave, maybe salary cuts, and as a last resort, then the redundancy option.
So that would be really a last resort, and we're not seeing it yet. I think there are many moving parts, and I think employees are waiting to see how this will unfold. Elizabeth, from a practical standpoint,
I think it's important to also appreciate that.
I'm sorry, please go ahead.
Yeah, so sorry, if I can just mention on the redundancy, it is not clear from the current framework that we have that you can actually declare redundancy in a situation like COVID-19. COVID-19 may be a temporary blip, which may disappear, as we all hope, very soon. It may be a much longer ride for us. We just don't know. What is clear, however, is that the framework that we have, the law that we have, doesn't actually deal with a pandemic of this sort. And so arguing, first of all, whether COVID fits into a redundancy as defined under the law will depend on the environment, will depend on the business, and I think employers will be well advised to take proper advice before they just assume that this translates to a situation that they can call redundancy.
Right. Thank you. Elizabeth, moving on to you from a practical perspective, this is obviously a very traumatizing time for certain employees. You know, there's a lot of uncertainty. Certain communication channels are no longer open. Some employees are working remotely, don't have contact with coworkers. What sort of support systems have you put in place, or would you advise employers to put in place to sort of address this anxiety that can arise, and to just care for your employees generally?
Yes, so thank you for that question. Rightly, it's a time uncertainty. Everybody, I think, one will be ways to get through this time, and we enjoy as their staff much as employee engagement is always a critical part of a thriving business, whether in a crisis or not, but even more in a crisis situation, our ability to engage our staff and keep them, top of mind is very important. So some of the things that we are doing consistently for those who are not, for most of us, we are working remotely, and even those who are in the office, because of the social distancing guidelines, for example, we are not allowing for meetings, physical face-to-face meetings, unless they are of very few people. So we've made, thankfully for technology, we have options that can keep us in touch with our staff. And so some of the things that we're doing is that we have daily team calls with our team members, so that the team leaders and the line managers and the CEOs can have, can just get a sense of what is going on with the staff wherever they are. And these meetings take different natures. You may have a business call that looks at the business side, and on another day you may take a call that then is just checking up on employees. How are you doing today? What's going on at home? How is the family? And it's always important to check in on that, because many people who are now working remotely are having to balance both work and school, especially those with families, because school also closed down. So we are having employees having to balance the three things and still run a home that is functional. So, conversations around what tips people are putting in place to ensure that all three run well. There's a lot of core sharing within these calls between employees that help create a learning environment where all of us are learning how to adjust to our new reality. We also do have formal employee assistance programs that we have in place that we are asking our employees to also be a part of at this point. So through, for example, our partnership with our medical provider, we do have counselors who are available to our employees. And one of the things that we have done is organize a webinar through Zoom, where staff have been able to log in and just listen into a counselor who talks about, our mental well-being during this time when we are handling a lot of change. And such fora is very important to help staff be able to debrief. Sometimes as an individual, you may not be able to know exactly what's happening to you or put words into it. But when you hear another staff talk about it or a counselor address it, then it helps you be able to process it better. We also have a hotline for those who may not be comfortable to be in a group setting where they are talking about, what their concerns are, but they may feel at any one point they'd like to talk to a professional. So we've availed such services to our staff to call in at any time. And this hotline is a toll-free line where it doesn't come at a cost to the employee, but they know that any time they can reach somebody on the other side who can help them through.
Would that be a medical provider that's answering these calls, or is someone from within your organization?
So typically we have on this call, on the end of this toll-free line is our medical provider, because they have professionals. Because when it comes to counseling, you do want to have professionals at a point. So these calls are typically availed for anyone who feels these other forums that we have provided did not work very well for them, and they still would want to go a further step and speak to a professional, then that is also available.
Okay. And one sensitive issue is this virus affects certain people more than others. So how do you identify those within the organization that are more vulnerable? So one, how do you identify them? And secondly, how do you deal with it to protect them?
Yeah. So what you've asked me, Karim, I think is about vulnerable staff and how would identify them. And the vulnerability in the context of COVID-19 has been well defined through the WHO and as well as our government ministries, where they're talking about people who are over a certain age, over 60 years and above, typically have been categorized as high vulnerability individuals. And then we have others who have underlying conditions that would include things like hypertension, heart diseases, and any other illnesses that have pre-existed that would sort of compromise an individual's immunity. So these have been highlighted, and what we do with all due sensitivity to the individual's confidentiality, we do then find a way of getting this information. We encourage self-disclosure when we define these conditions as as having been defined for our own good, for the individual's own good to disclose, then it is better taken. What we do is to be careful not to invite any sort of discrimination in that process. So where you get the individual to disclose it themselves, that is preferred, especially when it comes to medical status, which is a confidential status. When it comes to age, most organizations are clear on their age, the level, or rather the age group that will be in the workforce, and the HR departments will typically have those records, so they already know if you have any people who are outside the age limit or within the age limit that has been categorized as vulnerable. And so this is data that needs to be used appropriately to just ensure that we protect these people. So what we've done for us after identifying is just to ensure that we prioritize that those who are in these categories work from home, so that we reduce the risk of their exposure in the workplace. So, but then beyond that is to ensure that it is not used in any way as a discriminatory tool.
Now, in certain cases where you would identify a staff being unwell and potentially, suspect that he may have been infected with COVID-19, what responses do you have in place, or have you planned for such cases?
Right. So again, this is the process we use again is self-disclosure. Here we are saying that we are relying on each of us to actually take care of each other. So we've encouraged staff that should you be exposed to somebody who has tested positive for COVID-19, or in the earlier days when travel was still widely still going on, the guideline was that if you have been in contact with anyone who has traveled recently from one of the areas where COVID has been reported, then you need to self-disclose. So when we get that self-disclosure through the HR department, because we ask them to bring this information to the HR partner, then with that information, we are able to guide the staff on what to do next. We have a questionnaire that we have put in place. This has been guided by the doctors that we have. Thankfully, because we are an insurance company, we also have doctors who work in the company. So they have provided us with a questionnaire. And for those who might not have doctors in-house, this is information that you can actually get through the Ministry of Health, or even through your health provider, your health insurance provider. They can help you with this questionnaire that you then can take to the staff through, and it's really just to get a history of their exposure. And once it's clear, then you advise for us as a precautionary measure. We advise this staff to self-quarantine until such a time as whoever they were in contact with has been tested and it has been identified whether it's positive or negative. Then we know how to progress thereafter. But we encourage, or we advise for the mandatory 14-day quarantine period for anybody who has been in touch with an individual who has been infected or suspected to be infected. Beyond that, for any of staff, for example, who come down with the symptoms, it's the same process that we are following to just have a quick check on the exposure. And then if they show all the symptoms, then we then encourage them to follow the protocols that have been provided by the government. There is the hotline 719 that has been provided, where all suspected cases should call in for them to do an assessment, and then they would then advise you if to go in for testing. If an employee is already showing symptoms of illness, then you advise them to go in for testing. And once you have your test results, then it's important as an organization to then take the next steps to identify who else could have been exposed, and therefore go through the same process of advising self-quarantine. And then taking care to protect the confidentiality of individuals who are infected or who have family members who are infected. So always seek consent from the individual before you use their information within the organization to then take the next steps.
Thank you very much. I think it was a very interesting conversation. Before we wrap up, can I just ask both of you individually if you have any parting thoughts or any recommendations you would like to relay to both employers and employees to better navigate the current circumstances?
I think, Karim, one thing is for clear, we're really in very uncharted territory. No one has experienced anything like this in their lifetime. I think we can definitely say that in relation to what business people and individuals are experiencing as a result of this pandemic. So there is no right answer. What is important, though, is that we have a legal framework. The legal framework does not speak to a pandemic of this sort, And in fact, it's one of the things that we as a firm are very busy on, advising or suggesting some changes to the law, not just in the employment arena, but in the business arena, insolvency arena, and so forth, with the AG's office and the SG's office. Until those changes are actually effected, and we sincerely hope they are, because it will, I think, help businesses navigate these uncharted territories that we're in. I think it's important for employers and employees to have that line of communication. You know, you talked about the difficulties that many people have in dealing with the situation, particularly those who, unlike many employers, are unlikely to have the space, the comforts of having an office at home, the ability to shut the door and get some privacy so that they can get on with their work, maintain social distance, etc. That is not everyone's experience. And I think employers need to obviously think about their employees, and particularly the employees at the lower level who are unlikely to have the benefit of all these other benefits of working from home that employers and other categories of staff may well have at their home. And some, you know, when I talk to some people, they're actually enjoying the experience because it gives them a kind of freedom that they didn't have when they had to commute to the office every day. But being mindful of those employees, being mindful of the hardships that the vulnerable in society in particular are experiencing, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to think about them in particular as we try and keep our own businesses afloat and our own jobs in play as we go through this crisis.
Thank you. That was some very interesting thoughts. Elizabeth, anything from your end before we wrap up, please?
Yes, I would encourage all of us to stay positive, and I know that we have a big issue that is facing all of us, and what it has brought out is the resilience of the human spirit, because over the ages, whenever there have been calamities or catastrophes, the human race will always rise above it. So I would encourage us to stay positive, see a future beyond COVID, because there will be one, and we must focus on getting through this period, but also thinking about the future. It is a period that enables us or allows us opportunity to really be creative and do things differently. And I think we've already seen that displayed in some of the things that employers and even individuals have been able to do in this short time. I think we are seeing in the news, breakthrough outcomes, even in the medical field, where our own universities are developing the respirators. They're building respirators, something that we perhaps did not know we had the capability for, or we did not really focus on. But this opportunity or this case has actually given us an opportunity to see what we can do as a human race. So even as companies, let's explore what are those things that we can do differently for having gone through this kind of an experience. And that can only come if we look at this as a positive, a positive period that we can then harness for better. I'll also just, echo what Sonal talked about, just caring for one another, extend care to each other, to our employees. And I think I must commend many organizations who are already doing a lot for the employees, but each of us, even as individuals, we have opportunity to make the world better for somebody who may be a little worse off than we are. So this is a time to care and to show our humanness as we understand that we are all impacted by this one common enemy, and together we will be able to fight it. And then I'll also encourage that we work with facts. There's a lot of information out there, some of which sometimes is not factual. So let's get information from credible sources so that whatever decisions we take are based on facts and not on fear or knee-jerk reactions that may be short-lived. So let's work with facts. Let's consult as employers. I think Sonal was very clear about that. The best thing we can do at this point is to have consultative decisions with our staff and avoid unilateral decisions that could potentially make things worse in the long run. So engage, and work with facts. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, both of you. It was very interesting. Thank you for sharing your time, your experience, and doing it in a very positive and human manner. I think it'll be very helpful to the audience. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Stay safe.